Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Sunder Katwala. I'm the Director of British Future. Welcome to this webinar, Forgotten Sacrifice, How Can We Remember the Black and Asian Soldiers of the Second World War? This is an event as part of Black History Month. It's an event as part of the Remember Together campaign. And what that is all about is the fact that the armies that won the Second World War looked more like the Britain we live in today in 2020 than the Britain of 1940, because the 10 million who fought came from Britain and all across Britain, but also from all across the Commonwealth, from India, from Africa, from the West Indies, from Australasia, Canada, and beyond. And so this was an existential war about Britain and British democracy. It was a world war which was fought as well. And so today is part of the Remember Together's campaign, which is saying we need to mark that, we need to educate about it, we need to commemorate it better, and that this can unify people. A counterintuitive thought that history can unify people in our society. We've been having a lot of debates about history and identity with people on different sides, but here is a theme that we think people with very different political views can all get behind, and that can unite the country and can explain as well why remembrance, if you choose to participate in it, is open and inclusive of everybody in our society and is meaningful to people of every ethnic and faith background. That's the aim. We've got a great panel here to talk about it. This Remember Together campaign wants to take this to the public when we're beyond the restrictions we're under of COVID next year on Commonwealth Day and on Remembrance Season next year. So we want the ideas of the panel and the ideas of you, the audience, as well, not just on why does this matter, but what can we do with it and about it in our society. So hashtags today include hashtag Remember Together. You can use to share your views on social media as well. Our panel today, very well placed to get this discussion going. Patrick Vernon is an author, 100 Great Black Britons. He is a community activist for many years. He's awarded an OBE for that and has been involved in community action, making sure that Black history is on the agenda for many years. Katharine Birbalsingh, recently honoured in the honours list as a CBE. So we've got a very glittering honoured panel here, and that was for Katharine's work in education over many years, the founder of Michaela Community School. She's also a public commentator on education, identity, and many other issues. Zehra Zaidi is, among other things, the founder of the We Too Built Britain campaign, which is about recognising the diverse contributions to British history in a positive way. That's quite a new campaign, but it's made a breakthrough because it's already got the Royal Mint now debating which should be the first Black and Asian Britons to appear on coins in the future. And so Zehra has been acting and campaigning on issues of identity for many years. And Professor Daniel Todman is our expert historian today. He is a professor of modern history and the head of history department at Queen Mary University. He has written very authoritative books about the Commonwealth at war and about the war as a whole and what it means for Britain and British society. So to kick us off, Patrick, if I can come to you, forgotten sacrifice. There's more knowledge than there was, I think, of the Commonwealth contribution over the last 20 years, but we could do more with it. Tell us your take on why this matters and what we can do.
Yeah, it's great to be here today and to be part of really a partnership across all political parties to support this initiative, Remember Together. I think we now recognise that the contribution of the Commonwealth was paramount in terms of fighting fascism and defeating Hitler and Mussolini as well. And I think this is really important. It's taken such a long time. On VE Day, when we were all celebrating, well, we weren't, because we were alive then, basically, celebrating the victory, there were a number of Black soldiers that were around Pall Mall, and they weren't really valued, included in that celebration. And I think this is really critical. It's taken us a long time for that recognition. I'm a vice chair of the Bernard Grant Trust, and we look after the archives of Bernie Grant. And in the archives, he writes a letter to the Ministry of Defence in the 90s, demanding why is it that West Indian servicemen and women weren't invited to Remembrance Day Sunday and to march with other service personnel. It's been that kind of agitation for many, many decades. I can remember the Imperial War Museum when they had their War to Windrush exhibition, nearly 15, 16 years ago. And that exhibition was so popular, it remained in the Imperial War Museum for an extra year, and then it traveled around to the Caribbean. So there's been a real kind of push over the last 20 plus years to do this. And the reason why we're doing this is that, as Sunder said, that there was more diversity, ironically, during the Second World War, because people of colour all around the Commonwealth and former colonies saw it as their duty to, and some of them, many volunteered. Not everyone was conscripted. Lots of millions volunteered to make that difference. And, all of us have got family histories which support that. So in my family history, on my father's side of the family, they served in the First World War. They served in the Second World War. When my dad came over to the Midlands in the 1950s, he came to Wolverhampton because his uncle was based in the RAF base, RSS Cosford, just outside Wolverhampton. And then 10 years later, he sponsored my dad. That half the people, nearly a third of the people that were on the Empire Windrush ship that docked in Tilbury in June 1948, all were ex-service RAF people. So there's lots of these histories of different communities. I remember 5 years ago, I got invited to Sandhurst College, and they unveiled for the first time an exhibition recognising the African contribution, particularly to the Second World War. As you know, what happened in Burma, probably one of the most horrific aspects of the war. We don't really talk about it. Whoever served in Burma, not been given the same kind of status and recognition as so the RAF and and the usual stories of heroic people on planes. But that was a bloody war in terms of Burma. 150,000 Africans went to Burma, not being recognized, and I think the Sandhurst College decided to recognise some of the survivors of that war. And I met this guy called Mr. Ennis. They flew him over, they brought him over from Ghana, and he officially opened this memorial and exhibition recognising the African contribution, which was really, really amazing because he was in his late 80s, still had his faculties, shared his experiences, and there was a real camaraderie because there were some of the veterans who had served in Burma also shared their experiences as well. And I think this is really important because ultimately, the whole idea of remembrance is to say never again. But we now know post-war conflicts that still doesn't happen. But if we can educate, inform young people about that contribution, and to say that your grandparents and your great-grandparents served and made a difference, then that gives a sense of self-esteem and confidence, which is really, really important. Because if we don't have that, it gives the impression there's a deficit that we didn't contribute, and we did 10 times over. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Patrick, for getting us underway. So one thing that's happened today is that 50 people have signed a letter saying we should commit to doing more with this and about this. All of our panelists today are part of that group, and so that's going to go forward. And British Future have published an opinion poll as well, which finds that 78% of people agree that more focus on the Commonwealth contribution to World War II would be a positive way to promote understanding of a shared history of today's multi-ethnic Britain. 3% of people are against that. We're disappointed about the 3%. It's 3% among ethnic minorities, 3% among the white British. We'll keep trying with the 3%, but there's 8 out of 10 people to start with on side here. But we asked another question as well, which was, does remembrance unite people across all ethnic and faith backgrounds? Can it cause friction? And people feel it unites us, but that was 6 out of 10 people. And just under half of ethnic minorities thought that. And there's, a sizable minority, a fifth of people think it can cause friction. So maybe more focus on this could deal with that. But we've got an argument that unites people who disagree on a lot of other issues here. And the question is, what do we do about it? Katharine Birbalsingh, what's your experience been as an educator, as a commentator, about why this matters to identity and what we can do about it?
Well, I suppose it's very difficult to know if there's a problem, and if there is a problem, why there's a problem. So we begin with the assumption that that these things aren't taught in 2020 in schools. And when I say these things, that there was this contribution from the Commonwealth, from the Caribbean, from India, and so on. And the difficulty is that we don't really know what is taught in schools and what isn't taught in schools. The reason we don't know is because there are no assessments for history that take place until GCSE. And only 40% of children in Britain take history GCSE. So the discussion that's often had around what is taught at GCSE is almost meaningless, because that's for a minority of pupils. In fact, what matters is what's taught at primary school and what's taught at Key Stage 3, years 7, 8, and 9. And we don't actually know, because at the end of primary school, they have SATs, which tests English and maths, does not teach history or geography or science. And then there are no exams at the end of Key Stage 3, at the end of year 9. So all we have to go on, I suppose, are some textbooks, but textbooks aren't required. So what tends to happen in the debate is that one side say the contribution from the Commonwealth isn't taught, and that more must be done. And I'm not arguing one way or the other. I'm saying we don't know. The other side says, look at the national curriculum. There are loads of Black figures and Black historical events that are in it. Therefore, we've ticked that box. Well, unless you assess schools, unless children are assessed, you cannot guarantee that something is being taught. So you can guarantee English and maths is being taught at primary school because the children are assessed on that at the end of their primary school careers. I mean, frankly, and I just know this anecdotally, there are schools that don't teach history at all, right? So they do cross-curricular projects. This is quite a progressive way of teaching, actually, and is considered to be, all the rage. So the idea when people say, oh my goodness, there's this catastrophe, the non-white contribution to the Second World War is not being addressed. I would say that there is so much else that is also wrong with teaching in schools that that is one part of it. I'm a great believer in traditional teaching. That's another problem that happens in schools, which is the way in which things are taught. So if there is lots of noise in the classroom, lots of disruption, the teacher might be trying to teach these things, but if the children can't access it because of the disruption in the lesson, or because of the teaching methods that are being used. So when I say teaching methods, where memory isn't part of the focus, so they're being taught, but the teacher doesn't think to themselves, we need to make sure the children remember this stuff, then they leave school not remembering it. And then we say, well, it wasn't taught, but actually it was the way that it was taught and the environment in which it was taught that ensures that people don't necessarily remember it. Having said all of that, there's nothing that Patrick's just said that I don't agree with. It was a huge fight for many, many years for Black people to be recognized in terms of their contribution. The monument that that Black people wanted. It's been ridiculous the way in which Black people have been treated over the decades. The question is whether in 2020 that is still the case. And I just don't know, given the current situation with schools and assessment that is so poor, and the behavior that I find is poor in schools. But there are a lot of people that would disagree with me on that and say that behavior is just fine. I would argue differently. And I would say that this is just yet another example of we've got 20% of children who leave school functionally illiterate and functionally innumerate. This is yet another example of the ways in which, sadly, schools are not managing to meet what I would say is their duty to children in making sure they're well informed about their country and the society in which they live.
Thank you, Katharine. You've given us something to find out what's going on and how can it be done where it isn't being done, how can it be done better where it's being done badly. One thing we were able to find out during the First World War centenary was the public awareness of this, and we saw awareness of Indian soldiers rise from 4 out of 10 to 7 out of 10 as that centenary began. But it was interesting at the start, it was the one thing that young people were as likely to know as older people about the war. So that would probably add to the view that schools had started to teach it quite recently, but hadn't been teaching it over a longer period. Knowledge of African soldiers was quite a lot lower than that, but also rose. The First World War, more surprising, more distant to people, less well known, but a real opportunity perhaps to build on the progress that was made there, to introduce a new story, I think, to ethnic minority audiences, to white British audiences, but now to build on it as well. Zehra, that's what you've been doing with the We Too Built Britain campaign. It's about the story of contribution. Why is this important to you?
It's about the story of contribution, but it's also about commonalities. You know, what connects us? I mean, We Too Built Britain is very much the middle ground of trying to sort of go in between the so-called culture war of some extreme views, but each of which have value in themselves, but just say, what can we find that's common? And I really thank you for the invitation today, because I think the contribution of Asian and Black soldiers to both the wars is critically important to set out that cohesive agenda. For me, I mean, I guess I bring a much more personal perspective away from the We Too Built Britain campaign. My family is a forces family. We can trace our sort of service back to Mughal times and probably beyond, but I haven't heard beyond Mughal times. Both my grandfathers were commissioned officers in the British Indian Army, and my great-grandfather's brother was a commissioned colonel and was also at the same time part of the independence movement for India. So we're very much at the center of, you know, what does this mean for families? So I think, first of all, why it matters and how we can remember is for families like mine, it's personal. It's passed down through generations. It's part of our heritage. It's part of our feeling of identity. And why does that feeling, why is there such a feeling of pride? And I think there's 6 reasons, and some of them aren't purely personal. One, I think we need to look at probably the army itself. You know what, it's a question of values, and the values that connect them to your homeland, to Britain, to different groups around you. So that's the tradition of service, service in the forces, you know, respect, courage, commitment, loyalty, brotherhood. You know, are they British values? Are they universal values? Well, there are many of our values, right? I think that's really important. The second point is you've got to remember the context in which many people from the subcontinent stepped up to serve, particularly in the Second World War. There was, you know, poverty. You could be working agriculture, farming. You could join the forces, and that provided a way out of poverty. That provided skills and training, and again, that family, that brotherhood. You know, even though, and I accept, the working conditions for natives would not have been the same as for white Britons. My mother's father, who rose quite high in the army, was a native, you know, most of his working life until independence. You know, that was a reality. But still, you know, the context in which they served, it was a valuable job. 3, for some groups, and, you know, you've got to remember that the subcontinent and South Asia is as pluralistic as they come. My family happens to be a minority Muslim community who's sort of one of our skills was languages. So my mother's father spoke Turkish, Arabic, Persian, German, Urdu, Hindi, and English fluently. So you know, his entry, he was very much kind of the, you know, the person who bridged cultures, bridged gaps, and, you know, there was a place for minority traditions in the army, in the fact that on the field you're all equal. And I think for my family, I don't often see that talked about. The fourth point is, this is coming back more to Britain, but I do think it really connects, and I'm going to focus on Asia and South Asia. It really connects Asian families to Britain. We are here because you went there. And indeed, we've always contributed, and our history is your history, you know, both back home, because as you know, the effort in India carried on way beyond the end of war in the Second World War. And also, we also came to fight on the Western Front in the First World War. You know, our history is your history. And also, vis-a-vis cohesion and sort of racism and division, you know, there was a bigger evil if you like. There's a story that we all stepped up to serve to fight fascism, and I think that's really, really strong. And I really do believe that we have to try and find the commonalities wherever we can. And every family really has that story, and we saw during at times of division, the amount of times I've been asked during the EU referendum, or in the few incidents of racism I've had, what did your family do? Where have you come from? That story of my family's contribution to service and the war effort and to Britain has been an important story to tell and to connect me to people. And Sunder, that's one of the reasons why We Too Britain even started, those commonalities. The fifth thing is, I think it does show really how complex history is. Some people seem to think these ideas of complex history and inclusive history and decolonization are relatively new. For many of us, they've been going around for years, but for some families like mine, it's not even been a sort of politicized thing at all. It's just been part of our understanding, right? History was complex, the good and the bad. So for example, yes, in terms of complex history, yes, you stepped up to serve. Sometimes it was for a way out of poverty. Sometimes you had no choice. Sometimes it was pure service. Sometimes, and for some in my family, it was the pathway to independence. And the complexity of the past really comes in when you look at, for example, India. I talked to Daniel earlier about the idea in Britain, amongst the British Raj, of this idea of the martial races versus the non-martial races. And one thing that connects me, for example, to Sikhs, I live in Gloucestershire, the West Midlands is full of, it's obviously got the Sikh memorial, but one thing that we often talk about, community to community, is this idea of the Sikhs and the Muslims were deemed to be part of these martial races that could fight. Yes, you can talk about divide and rule, but there's that history that's always been navigated amongst some families, where it's not actually seen that complicated. It was just almost fact. And the sixth thing really, and I think this, this really goes to the heart of, did you fight for the British against your own people, for example, that contention. A lot of people, particularly from South Asia and who wanted independence, did step up to serve to help that independence movement. The First World War was the beginning of that, really, and you then saw the government of India Act 1919 that created the first sort of, if you like, more devolved powers down, although most of the powers really still lay with the British. And then the Second World War really accelerated that. And obviously, when you think of the idea of nationhood, the idea to protect your own nation, to have a military, is central to that idea of nationhood. So that is actually a source of pride for many people. I think we sort of forget that. So for my family, it's just been so important. And vis-a-vis the division, I think it does, and this is my final comment really, when we saw the images from the cenotaph of, things being defaced, it didn't just offend white British military families. It offended me to the core, because those were my forefathers, or my forefathers' colleagues, or my forefathers could have been in that position. And I think it's important to realize that this shared heritage really can both help us directly connect and then to help us find those points of commonality.
Thank you, Zehra, for sharing why it's personal for you. Professor Todman, history, you're a professional historian, you're interested in the public debate about history. You work on the Second World War. It's probably the one bit of history we think we know something about. But why do you think, what would you like us to think more on about this history?
Oh, it's just one of the joys of my job, Sunder, is that everybody thinks they know something about it. So I'm going to say three things. First of all, thanks for the opportunity to engage in such an interesting moment. So the three things I want to talk about are about history and memory, about complexity, and about a risk and a hope. So I think we're at a really interesting moment because we're just at the edge of the Second World War dropping off the memory cliff, in the sense that generationally we've come so far from it that the last veterans, the last of those who experienced it as adults, are not going to be with us for much longer. And we know from work on the First World War that can be a moment of change in how people think. It can also be a moment of opportunity in terms of thinking about past conflicts in different ways. it can also be a point where versions of the war get stuck, because one of the things that those who experienced it at first hand often bring is a variety of perspectives and a complexity in a different voice. And once they're gone, it can be easier for a single version to take over. So I think, in recent years in particular, you'd have seen historians of the Second World War and of Britain in the Second World War in particular, writing it as a history of an empire at war, not just of the United Kingdom. I'm not sure that has fully worked its way through popular representations of the conflict, particularly around remembrance, although that, the trend that Patrick identified has definitely been there. So maybe we're at a point where as we shift generationally, there's also a chance to think about what we want that remembrance to look like in the future. So the second thing I was going to talk about was about complexity. And I think the complexity is the good bit, but just to give some examples of that, Zehra's already talked about why people served, and that being something which is complex in anybody who's looked at motivations for joining up, let alone motivations for service or desertion in combat. Well, no, they're very complicated, very individual, no matter who you're looking at. But questions about what people were fighting for, what they were serving for, and ultimately what they were deployed for. I mean, I think the example of Burma is very interesting, isn't it? So you've got, this very large-scale deployment of soldiers from the Indian subcontinent, from Africa, fighting to regain control of a British colony, which didn't necessarily want to be British. So the tensions that created for Burmese combatants on both sides of the line, for Indian combatants on both sides of the line, is, I think, something that's really interesting to explore. We might also look at when the war exactly finished. If you're an Indian soldier who joins up to defend India from Japan, or for reasons of trying to get money for your family, but then you find yourself in 1946 deployed to Indonesia to fight for the restoration of Dutch colonial rule, what is this war really about? Similarly, I mean, since we started talking particularly about soldiers as sorts of servicemen, the history of the deployment of the Caribbean Regiment, the fact that it doesn't get sent into combat as many of its soldiers wanted to, partly because of a tradition of martial racist ideas, partly because it would, from the point of view of some British generals, it would just have been too divisive to have relatively well-paid Caribbean soldiers serving alongside African soldiers, and that might have created conflict. So I think complexity arises whenever we look at the details of the war. But that's great, because actually what we need to do is use the past to help us grapple with a very complex present. And one of the things that I think Sunder's very good at, and one of the reasons I enjoy following him on Twitter so much, is he's very good at showing how people deal with complexity in their own individual lives all the time. So the idea that the public can't cope with complexity is, I think, mistaken. Actually, people are managing complex situations all the time. It's just about how you help or support them in doing that when it comes to historical events. So maybe the risk with that complexity is, how do we engage with it in a way that doesn't either alienate people or lead to further divides? So my final point is about a risk and a hope. I think the risk in the discussion we're having today is that service becomes the only measure of participation. And for me, that really undersells the experience and the history of a total war. It makes participation in that war about men in uniform. And I think one of the things that I'd want to any widening discussion to show is the effect of these conflicts on the imperial home fronts, actually. And that's where I think, if you're not looking at, for example, the effect of how the war was paid for on the experience of people in India, you're not really understanding the impact that the war had. But my hope is that you've got to have a route in. And it seems to me there is this strong shared sense of wanting to commemorate military service. And maybe that's the route through which you begin to engage and start to be able to talk about things which are more difficult, but around which hopefully there's still a measure of agreement to be had.
Great, thanks. I think that's a really interesting question. What are the ways in that open up the story? Now, Daniel mentioned something really important, that we're 2 decades now from a centenary, but what we do right now in the next 5 years will affect what we've got when we get to a centenary in which there's no living memory left. We've got the letter that's been signed today has been signed by 2 Second World War veterans. Alan Wilmot was born in Jamaica, was in the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force. Mohammed Hussein was born in what is now Pakistan, and they're 95 and 96. He served at the Battle of Monte Cassino. So it's a really crucial moment as to whether across the generations we're going to have that information, that knowledge, and then think about what it means later. Now the Q&A is open. Many of you have already been putting questions into it, and so let me bring the panel in to ask on some of your questions. Picking up on the point that Daniel ended on there, our first question is from Delisha, who's a student at Eden Girls' School in London, and she says, when we talk about this history, it can all be about men with guns. How is this to be made more relevant as well to the 50% of the population who are female? Well, Daniel was giving us some thoughts about that. Zehra, what's your feeling about that?
Well, the Wheat About Britain really started because of one Muslim woman who was not a soldier. The memory of Noor Inayat Khan. She was one of only 4 women awarded the George Cross. And she was a Sufi, she was pacifist, and she was actually a writer, a musician. She was working on children's books, and she was global. She was living in France, Indian origin, and she volunteered for the war effort. And she was the first female radio, and she was trained as a radio operator, and she was the first radio operator to be sent to enemy-occupied France. And when I started to tell that story, and many have told it a lot better than me in a lot more detail. For example, Shrabani Basu wrote the sort of the seminal biography on Noor Inayat Khan, and there's been even a Doctor Who episode after. But people didn't know her story, and I found it quite incredible. And when I went around, for example, mosque groups, they found it so inspiring that Muslims had always contributed to the history of this country. So it wasn't just soldiers. And I guess Daniel's point's right, that we need to tell those other stories of people who worked in nursing, or who set up charities, or who provided some of the other operational functions. Thanks,
Zehra. Katharine, what's your sense about this question, specifically about gender, but also the broader questions Daniel was making about those who served and the societies they were part of?
Well, I mean, of course, I always see all of this through school. I mean, we teach about Noor Khan, and we teach all of this stuff, but then that's our school. I don't know what's happening in the other schools. I think that there probably is a tendency, if you have, although I'm guessing, if you have an ethnically diverse community in your school, to try and teach this from with a broader view. I suspect that perhaps in schools where where it's less diverse, there's less of a push towards doing so. Although I don't really know. And obviously, it matters what we teach our children and how much they remember once they leave school, because that gives them a general understanding of what the world looks like. And it's just so hard to tell. It's so hard to know. And it's hard to know because we don't, as a country, really believe in assessment. And there are too many people who campaign against assessment, feeling that it's somehow cruel to children to assess them. And what I would just say that, and this is the interesting thing about this debate, is that often the people who want this sort of thing taught more are the very people who are against assessment. So if you want children to learn about this stuff, you have to embrace assessment. And that is something that I found too many progressives are unwilling to do. And so it's unlikely much will change in our schools unless essentially the progressives change their position on assessment.
Okay, so it's also about the methods of teaching. Daniel, how would you try and open up the history as the question was asking?
I think I'd probably try and teach about phenomena rather than about nations. So it seems to me that one of the ways you could write this history globally would be to think about it as a history of coping with disruption. what's a role that women across the globe have to play when they face, in the face of war. It's about households being disrupted, men going away on service, women having to work, perhaps not because they want to work, but because they've got to keep their kids fed. Maybe it's about managing physical displacement. And I think there are big commonalities there that you could teach across place that would be inclusive for children of widely different backgrounds. I think it's very interesting. I mean, it's interesting that what Katharine is saying echoes lots of the things that my friend and colleague Katrina Pennell found about the First World War, that actually it's just very, very hard to know what's taught in schools, except around what's assessed. So maybe some of that has to come from things that aren't happening in the classroom, in terms of how we think about it.
Great. And but Patrick, on this specific question about gender and how that relates, I'm interested in your view. Also, just any sense you have about what we know about what has or hasn't changed over recent years in schools and beyond.
Well, I think there's been a long history, definitely, of Black women involved in war conflicts. Just have to look at Nanny the Maroons, Queen Zehra, Mary Seacole, but actually there were quite a few women that served in the Second World War, and I've had the privilege of being involved in some oral history projects where I've actually interviewed a number of women who served in the Second World War. And actually, there was one project I worked with a school in Todman, and actually they were interviewed by young women, and they wanted to find out what was it like to serve in the Second World War, and because I think the Second World War is partly glamorized a bit, like you hear these stories about American GIs, stockings and fancy cigarettes, there's that kind of glamorized bit there, but obviously there's another side to that. And the women, both women that were involved, Norma and Esther, they were both members of the ATS, and they said that they talked about some aspects of discrimination, but they talked about how they were welcomed and invited. Slightly different experiences from the men, actually, when you interview them about their experiences of the Second World War. And they stayed on in Britain after the Second World War, whereas a lot of people were demobbed back to the Caribbean, actually. And I think that the young women that interviewed them said that's fantastic. The way that they described their experiences, even simple things about makeup and hair and that kind of stuff, it kind of glamorized the war. And they said, the women said, the young girl said, I would volunteer for the Second World War. I'm not quite sure about Iraq and other conflicts, but definitely the Second World War, because there is that glamorization, which is further reinforced by Hollywood, unfortunately, around that. But I think there is a long, Hammersmith Council some years ago did a fantastic video interviewing Caribbean women for the Second World War. And you have these, the problem with what we've got actually, in different archives and museums around the UK, there's these podcasts, little interviews of people of colour who've served in Second World War, and somehow we need to pull them all together. I mean, the Imperial War Museum's got some bit of it, have got some stuff, and National Maritime Museum's got some bits, National Army Museum's got some stuff. Obviously, British Futures, you've done stuff as well. What we need to bring it all together and to showcase that, really, going back to the point that Daniel was saying, because these voices won't last for another 5-10 years. So we need to somehow have this national depository of women and all people who've been involved on the Commonwealth.
I think this is a brilliant theme. What we do with the oral history we've already got, but also is there a great opportunity now in that intergenerational contact to do more oral history well and hold on to it? Because I think, as Katharine's saying, whether people are taught things and how they remember them. I think we've certainly heard from young people that they do also want history to be quite hands-on like that, and so oral history, actually, if we can get it right, is a good way to do that. Lucy Williams has a comment on teaching. She says teachers can get a lot of flack from government, the media, from other people. She thinks teachers are willing on this, but want more support, and that's the key. Now, here's another question. Jenny Rathbone, who's a member of the Welsh Senedd, the Welsh Parliament, and she wants to know more about the treatment of servicemen, Black servicemen during World War II. And she says, we probably know more about the mistreatment of black soldiers sent, to Vietnam for the US. What do we know about the UK military record in the Second World War, the treatment at the time, as well as the recognition afterwards? What more can we know about that? Daniel, can you tell us anything about that?
It depends a bit on which group of service personnel you're looking at. One of the interesting things is how relatively difficult it is to trace Black British servicemen who were here before the start of the war, because of the way that their service was coded. So actually, it's not. If they were British citizens, they were liable to, and resident in the UK, they were liable to call up in the same way as any other male member of the population. So actually, I think there's a history still to be uncovered there, actually, about Black British service, which people like Stephen Bourne have done fantastic work on, but there's still more to do. In terms of Caribbean military service, we know that there's it's both a manpower need, so Britain needs more troops and particularly skilled technicians. That's one reason that it reaches out to servicemen from the West Indies. But one reason for, one of the problems that creates is how will these men serve? And are they going to be allowed into the RAF? If they're in the RAF, what work are they going to do? Their own testimony speaks of a range of different experiences, some experiencing a lot of discrimination, some very disappointed in their service, others saying that's not what they went through. It's clear that the Caribbean Regiment, when it's formed, is excluded from the military service that many of its soldiers wanted to have, and sent to do garrison duty in Egypt. And that's partly because of these ideas about martial races and whether men will be good fighters, but it's also about the tension between a colonial politics and military need. So I think it's a complex history. We talked about that before, but not one that's simply about discrimination. It's also about success, about individual coping. I think that's one of the things that gives it the most room to be explored. Actually, is it's a chance to talk about how individuals manage in the middle of this cataclysmic global event, and that gives us lots of different ways in to explore it.
Zehra, what would you like to know more about, what it was like for those who served themselves?
I think, I would love to see a book like Kavita Puri did on Partition Voices, narrating the stories or the passed down stories of those who served on the front line, whatever their background. Because, for example, you've seen, there are stories of the British being really amenable to having curries being sent to the front line and religious practices being observed. And yet there was lower pay or racism. It is rather complex. And the interesting thing for me, not so much about looking into the past, but the way my family's been sort of enmeshed with military history really teaches you lessons for today. Today we have complexity, right? Britain's a great country to live in. There's a hell of a lot less racism than when my father came here, or where our forefathers before that came. But, there are still issues, and those are constant battles, right? But how can we overcome them? So I think telling those stories and not dealing with complexity. Daniel and I are on the same page here, but really we've got to see complexity as an advantage, as something that elucidates the area. It doesn't pit one group against the other. It doesn't reinforce a political position. It actually shows us how things are not one-dimensional.
Thanks. Patrick, how do those who did serve want this story to be told in your experience of engaging with them?
It's very simple. Quite a few of the ex-servicemen, who some of them are passed on, have actually written their memoirs. It's like Cy Grant, Sam King, Alan Wilmot's got his memoirs. I I made a documentary about one veteran, Eddie Martin Noble, who wrote Jamaican Airman, which was then used as part of the Small Islands, because as part of that. And so there are quite a few biographies. I mean, it raised the issue about publishing, and having a bigger platform for those biographies and autobiographies that have been written already. Stephen Bourne's done some great work based on his research work on some of these primary first-hand information. So one person I knew very well, Eddie Martin Noble, served in the RAF in 1943, based in RAF base in East Anglia. And one of the key things that you have to recognise, Winston Churchill did not want particularly Caribbeans to be serving in the Second World War. It was only because he was lobbied by officials at the War Office and influential Caribbean business people that they allowed voluntary conscription in 1943. And Eddie volunteered. Not only did he wanted to fight fascism, he wanted to come to Britain and get a law degree. I mean, you know, people chose things for personal reasons. It wasn't like it was about the war. It was about what could I get out of this as well and get paid and stuff like that. So I think we have to recognise that. And there was a colour bar in the RAF, and there were only a handful of navigators like Cy Grant, who was actually captured the enemy lines in Holland. Elliot Cross was one of very few pilots, basically, and then he played a key role in the independence movement in Ghana. So, you know, we've got these stories. I mean, only last year a major movie came out about the life of Elliot Cross. So we've got this information does exist. And I think it's about how do you put more resources in there to make it more visible, because the stories are there already, basically. And also, going back to the women's story, some women have written their stories as well. So organisation like the Windrush Foundation, they've documented a lot of the veterans, men and women's stories as well. So funded by the HLF, and there've been quite a few HLF funded projects on remembrance and war. But it goes back to my point, people don't know about those stuff. Unless you're a historian or have a personal interest in this area, the average person would not know this.
Yeah, and I think that's very important, and it relates to what Katharine was saying as well. We're talking about the value of all the complexity being in, but this is something that people need a starting point on as well. And if we don't find the entry point for something that is, especially when you get beyond Hitler's on one side and we're on the other side, it's quite complicated to get beyond that. And so finding the starting points that don't falsify it is important. Here's another question. Katharine, I'll bring you in on this, but Joseph Haig has asked a couple of questions, and they reflect something Daniel Todman actually wrote for British Future before the First World War centenary about the importance of complexity, and not saying this is just, you know, because this is an imperial story, if you just make it too safe. But Joseph's question really is if is there a tension between sort of the frames of remembrance and making that inclusive and this complexity and interrogation? Do we risk, he asked, while he says this is important, do we risk somehow inadvertently saying that ethnic minority claims to national belonging have now become somehow conditional on ancestral military contribution? So is remembrance kind of a useful thing to use? Is it the opposite of complexity, or does it, you know, is it too simple? That's the question in a way. Katharine, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, no, I mean, all white people don't necessarily have ancestors who participated in the war as such, and all non-whites don't either. So I don't think it matters. I think that as a country, we need to be grateful, as we always teach the children at school, we need to be grateful to those who died so that we could live in a country where we are free. I mean, at our school, there are children of many different religions and different ethnicities who are all friends with each other, who don't even question the freedom that they have to be able to do that. And of course, we are able to do that thanks to soldiers of a variety of different backgrounds who gave their lives for us to be free. So, you know, we teach that. As I was saying earlier about the importance of, you know, when we were talking about women involved in the war and so on, and not just that war, we also look at other wars. But I do think it's important for all of us to recognize how important school is in educating the public. So when we talk, I mean, and there's wonderful ideas here, and we talk about documentaries, and we talk about having these wonderful exhibits and discussions and so on, which is great. But of course, it's only a small minority of people who ever access that sort of thing, whereas everybody goes to school. And if we want everyone to have a general understanding of what we're talking about, because then they're not necessarily going to access all the complexities. They need to have a basic understanding that needs to be taught in schools. And what I'd say is that in order to access complexity later, children need a schema in their heads, which I always think of as like coat pegs. And once you've got all those coat pegs, and once history has been taught chronologically, then when you learn more stuff, when you're out in the world, you can then put it on those coat pegs. But if the coat pegs have never been established in the first place, then the coats kind of fall because there's nothing to hang them on in there. So it's our duty in schools to make that happen. Now, how can that happen? Because it's not currently happening. And there's a whole variety of reasons why it's not happening. And people like you could put pressure on schools because pressure needs to come from all different sides, I think, in order for schools to recognize how problematic it is that we don't, I come back to the, we don't use traditional methods of education within our schools. And I think this is this particular argument, it has lots of power because the progressives who normally argue against assessment and don't really necessarily see the value of teaching history chronologically and having those coat pegs, as I said, they do want this stuff taught properly. So there's a really strong argument to try and push forward. So, people like you who are involved in this, it would be wonderful to see you putting pressure on the education system to move with respect to assessment and tradition.
That's interesting. I mean, the different ways in which there are overlapping coalitions here. You see an opportunity to have progressives talking about the history that people know. I think other people see the opportunity to have, conservatives talking about ethnic minority contributions of Black history as well. So there's an overlapping coalition here. Daniel, this is something that you've worried about a bit, I think, recognizing, commemorating service and sacrifice in the context of an empire. How do we think about that?
Yes, I mean, I think there's a risk that remembrance by its nature can be an uncritical space, where it's hard to have divergent views, because it can often be cast in terms of respect. In a way, the systems of remembrance that we've established are about trying to avoid disagreement. And that can make it, I think, difficult for different voices, or for the critical stance that I would see as an essential part of being a historian, to come through. Because if what you're doing is essentially disrespecting the dead, then there's not a space for you in this kind of commemorative space. I think in the end that probably comes back to the point about, well, what were these fights for? And if they were about preserving rights that included freedom of speech, then they also include the right to disagree with them, or to have divergent views. I do think that there is I would be worried. I raised that point about is service the only thing that you want to commemorate? Do you want to be able to be more critical of it? At the same time, I'm somebody who thinks that probably nations do need militaries, and I'm grateful that somebody else is willing to do that job, so I don't have to do it. So I can recognise the complexity in my own position as well. The other thing I think is important to think about is that because if you think about the Second World War as a war of empires, lots of those who we would want to participate in thinking about that conflict, in thinking about veterans, in thinking about the shift from one generation to another, are people who will have experienced it from different imperial points of view. That this shouldn't be a space that's exclusively for those whose ancestors came from within the British Empire. This is actually one that, you know, if your ancestors were Eastern European Jews who arrived in the UK after persecution by the Tsarist Empire, you know, you too faced tensions around what does imperial service mean in the First World War. So I think that's why I think it's worth having a space where you can celebrate and commemorate all involvement. I'm always pleased when I discover examples of people who managed to get what they wanted out of their wartime service. If you manage to manipulate this vast military machine to get something that does well for the individual, well done you, because that's not a triumph that most people manage to achieve for themselves. But that's not a space that's there really within Remembrance Day, for example.
Yeah. Thanks, Daniel. Patrick, is there or isn't there, in your experience, a tension within Remembrance because of that context?
It's interesting. I was involved in a project within Pro War Museum about 4 or 5 years ago called Whose Remembrance? And there was a number of us reflecting the Southeast Asian contribution to Second World War, the African Caribbean contribution to Second World War in the context of war. And people have got different takes on remembrance. Often the dominant narrative is, you know, we fought fascism and we've got a better society. Debate, but the other aspects around remembrance is still the hurt, loss of recognition. I can remember when we had the Commonwealth Games in Glasgow, and there was a special, this is more connected with the First World War, but still relevant to Second World War. There was a special church service in Glasgow Cathedral. I got an invitation, don't know how I got an invitation, but I got an invitation, and they had all the heads of states of the Commonwealth. They had all the Prime Minister, all the leaders of all the main political parties in Britain that were present, and it was actually compared by Trent MacDonald, and they had various speakers reflecting the Dominions. So you had people talk about the Australian contribution, the Canadian contribution, the Southeast India, Pakistan's contribution. When it came to the African contribution, guess who spoke about the African contribution in terms of anyone from a head of state or a military person, that's what they had. No one, apart from Trent MacDonald. He was like a proxy, because during the Second World War and even the First World War, no one of African heritage was given a Victoria Cross. We had to wait for Johnson Bahari in 2004 for that to happen, and he's the second black person ever to have one. So for some people, our remembrance is there's lack of recognition of people who did make a sacrifice, weren't given opportunities, and weren't even honoured about that. Even now, we're still campaigning for Walter Tull to get his military cross. So this is an aspect of remembrance people don't talk about lack of that recognition, which I think is really important. And going back to Katharine's point, you're quite right, Katharine, about the point that you raised about schools. We have to put pressure on schools and work with schools, and you know, the whole assessment stuff. I mean, I'm not averse to assessment stuff. I think it's how is assessment used, and based on the experiences of lots of young people and pupils over the last 4 or 5 decades. Often assessments used against them, not for them. So I think that's really important.
Thanks. Zehra, what are your thoughts about this? You know, remembrance, sometimes as a safe space, sometimes as a space where people are looking for more recognition.
I mean, I think there's space for all of those views, right? I mean, I find the discussion around poppies alone illustrative of that. I mean, for me, you know, I've always worn a red poppy. It's, you know, there's clearly a white poppy, there's black poppy, and it was a huge source of pride to me when British Future brought out the Khadi poppy, because that was very much about the South Asian contribution. And you know, it can be politicized. Of course, one angle can be viewed, but this goes back to Daniel's point about what's your entry point, right? So remembrance is one way where people understand the basic points, right? There's a certain, and I accept Katharine's point that, you know, not all white Britons served in the army, not all Asian, no, I've met plenty of Asian families who have no connection to my family's history, and they don't see that as a, and they might have more negative views of the fact that people had to serve for a foreign power miles away under awful conditions. And I've had those conversations, but it is that entry point. But the other way to look at it is, and what would be great, and I guess this, some of the sort of decolonization talk has been looking at the people that were left behind. Daniel made this point about the women that were left behind to keep the families together, to go off and work. And, that was probably more acute in families with high social disadvantage. So, if the male member of the family went off because the army was a more secure livelihood, and they were, as Patrick said earlier, you could probably go and study abroad and you hoped for this great future. Well, what was then the woman left with? It was hugely traumatic. And I think that really should be looked at more, because that, the villages, the towns from which these mainly men came from, they were left to pick up the pieces and to create this cohesive bond and a sense of community when these men returned. And they returned having, post-traumatic stress, injured, perhaps not being able to work, and the community and the women were then there to pick up the pieces again. I mean, as a final point, my part of my family moved from India to Pakistan during partition, and my grandmother my father's mother set up a charity for widows, so that they could get employment, they could be trained. So it's very much part of it's at least how I see this should be viewed. Thanks.
The Cardi Poppy was a very good initiative. The Royal British Legion, I think Lord Guardian did that. You've credited British Future there, Zehra. I think we've been involved in other things, but not that one, which is fine. I mean, my sense has always been that remembrance is powerful because it is voluntary. So if we have people trying to impose it on people, they're missing the point. But also, if you don't know the full history of your country, you don't have the information to make your own informed choice, really. And so really, people knowing this history, I think what we're all saying here today is accessibility is really important, entry points for people who don't have a way in, and we get to complexity. Complexity's got to be in, and we don't close it down. But that then gives us the big question for the campaign that we want to run and take forward. You've got 50 people saying this is important, more people should do about it. It's the how. And so we're thinking about Commonwealth Day next year. We're thinking about remembrance next year as a time where we'll be less restricted, we all hope, and the public could participate in that. So what could change? What could be done? Is it something we can do as citizens? Is it something schools can do? Is it something government should do? Other ways? What do you think we could do to raise awareness, give more people an entry point and start these conversations? I'd really be interested to hear everybody's views on something you'd like to see. I mean, Zehra, you've been campaigning We Too Built Britain for more awareness. How do we do it?
I mean, for me, a lot of it is through personal stories to see this. Essentially, We Too Built Britain has been using symbols, whether it's the people you decide to put on banknotes or coins that that show the banknotes and coins essentially show the contribution of the people that we want to represent as a nation in terms of who contributed to British culture, society, and economy, or statues or public art. So we've been sort of looking at mainly through symbols, but stories is a massive important part of that, whether through oral history or writing about it, down to the granular level of what's actually taught in schools. But I think the so-called remembrance days, whether it's Commonwealth Day, Remembrance Day, are pretty important. There's two things that I'd like to see more of. One, in countries of origin, this, let's have an Anzac Day, across the board. Let's really make those links a lot more explicit. And then the second thing is, I think, I don't think people know. I was on a panel a few months ago about the service of Indians to the two wars. And I was asked, because nobody knew, how many monuments did we have in Britain about that service? You could mention the Sikh Memorial in Staffordshire in the Arboretum Park. You could name, the Chattery Monument down in Sussex. You obviously have Neuve Chapelle, which honours on the continent, that honours all Indians who served. But there's not that much And it might be a case to look at what can we do that brings everyone together. And it may not be just South Asian, it may be Commonwealth. Look at that service. I think that might be quite important. And that service can be then broadened out to not just those people who served in a military capacity, but beyond.
Thanks. And in this conversation, as often happens, we're putting a lot of pressure on schools. And as Katharine has said, we don't necessarily know what's happening in schools. To some extent, I think the experience of the First World War centenary was that schools that were nervous about doing this found, in the diversity angle here, found that once you did it, it worked very, very well. But as Katharine said earlier, making sure this is relevant to majority white schools and to schools in undiverse areas might be just as important as making it relevant to schools that are very multi-ethnic, if this is a national story. But while I suppose that's working quite well in education when it's done well, that hasn't really necessarily come across yet in the local civic ceremonies you have at local cenotaphs and so on. You might have a very diverse group of wreath layers from different minority faiths, but you will be looking at a very white audience, partly because it's a much older audience as well. And so there's probably, it probably takes some time to come through. So one thing British Future did in Bradford was with the linking network that links schools together. We'd had primary schools doing things together. They did things that went to the memorial service in Bradford, and because the school children and their parents were there, just by having that one project, you had a broadening out of who was there that Sunday. But it might be that working out how to do that is challenging. Katharine, what do you think we could do to do more of this better?
Well, I mean, it depends on whether or not we want to include schools in this. I think it's a mistake to think about schools individually. Things need to be changed centrally. So when I talk about assessment, I'm talking about that would change all schools and what is taught in all schools. That's what needs to be done. I mean, of course, we can make some difference by you talk to a head teacher here, you talk to a head teacher there, and they make a few changes in their school. But if you want wholesale change across the country, then assessment needs to be changed across the country. If we give up on schools, then I always think that movies are a really good way of having impact on popular culture. People learn a lot from movies, actually, when they haven't learned much at school. So that's one route. Because the other things, while they're all good, they only ever catch a few people, and that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. But I'm into, I'm always fighting for wholesale change across the country. So, that's.
I think that's great. I think big is great. I mean, if you saw a shift on Indian soldiers from 40% to 70%, that's because the BBC, things like the BBC got, understood that mattered and got behind it. So Katharine's idea is we're making a movie. So that's very exciting. I'm looking forward to doing that. Daniel.
Well, I think I think those are excellent routes forward. I think I'd go for the local civic, and I'd think about place rather than individuals. I think individuals are a very powerful way in to get complexity and difference, because once you go down to the individual level, people are complex. But I think this is a global war, and it affected places in Britain globally. You wouldn't find somewhere in the UK that wasn't somehow linked to this global conflict, whether that's by people moving around, coming to the UK or going out from it, or whether it's by resources coming in or weapons or equipment going out. So I think what I would do is to try and engage at a local civic level with exploring those connections. The problem is that requires resource and support. We're maybe moving into a period where that's going to be even sparser. But if you wanted to have some great project to bring Britain back together and to teach it the complexity which is going to be so important in grappling with the challenges of the future, we're better to start with this thing which is still a foundational myth in so many ways.
Thank you, Daniel. Patrick, what would be top of your wish list as something we could change and make happen?
I think all of the above, maybe. I think definitely, if you look at what happened with the commemorations around the First World War, and I know that's he was involved in some of the work with British Futures, but the amount of money that was spent on the commemorations I don't think personally reflected the conversation that we're having today. So I don't know what plans they have afoot in terms of the government around commemoration, because I know that, for example, in Peru War Museum are revamping their exhibitions connected to the Second World War, and they're going to have a series of events and conversations around that. But personally, in the context of Black Lives Matter and in the context of the whole debate around statues and memorial and the historiography of Britain, this is a good opportunity to have more memorials reflecting the diversity of the contribution. As Zehra said, she gave examples of ones reflecting the Southeast Asian community. In the UK, apart from the recent memorial that was done by Nubian Jack in Windsor Square about 3 years ago, which actually is the best of all African and Caribbean troops and everyone, but of all conflicts, and the Mary Seacole statue. There aren't that many. There's murals, and that's good, but we need to have more. It's very clear. We need to have more, and it's not saying that we should replace Winston Churchill and have another person in place. We should have additional. And I think that's one thing. I think in terms of the national curriculum, it could be a bit more explicit about the Commonwealth contribution. And I think that's part of the campaign that we're working on, to have that inclusion, that this history is part of British history as well. I think that's really, really critical. And yes, Katharine said we should have more movies. There have been quite a few documentaries over the years reflecting, I've seen some really powerful poetic short documentaries about Southeast Asian war contributions, but it never gets in the mainstream. It's not in the schools. Not Katharine's seen these. How do we make it a depository that schools can access to supplement their lesson plans, whether it's in history, geography, or cross studies? I think that's a big question. It really is, actually.
So some big ideas there. We've got education, we've got commemoration and recognition, we've got public engagement. My dogs are now making their views heard. They're very in favour of everything they've just heard. So what I'd like to say, just to end this, is not just to thank the panel, but say to those of you in the audience, we need your help with this. We are going to campaign for changes. They might be policy changes, as Katharine says. They might be things we're going to do, things that can happen locally. We need your help. What are those ideas? How can you help us make them happen? We're thinking about Commonwealth Day next year. We're thinking about Remembrance Season, when hopefully COVID restrictions will not be where they are today. So we'd love to hear from you about your ideas, your experiences, what would make a difference. What we know today is there's a very broad coalition of people who think this is important. What we've now got to do is work out how we can make a difference, so we really build public awareness and have those debates. Thank you very much, everybody who took part, listened in, sent in your questions. Thanks especially to Patrick and Katharine and Zehra and Daniel for leading the debate. But please stay in touch with us. Let us know how you'd like to get involved, so this can be the start of the debate, not the end of the debate. And thanks everybody for coming along and watching and listening today. Thank you.